Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me for another interview. And today I have my interviewee live in the studio, which is very nice. I love doing these where my interview is actually in the studio. Now you may remember Chris Hare was here a month or so ago.
Couple of months.
Was it? Promoting a fascinating book about Hilaire Belloc. We'll give you a quick flash. Could you just show it up onto the screen there, Chris? That would be
for anyone.
There we are, you see. We had a wonderful conversation about the man of the moment and comparing his time with the weird times that we were going through now. Now, a lot of history we've looked at and interpreted, and many of my guests have spoken about history throughout this recent time. We've had the King's coronation, and there's been a whole load of suggestions about what that means or what it doesn't mean. So I thought it would be quite nice to get a classical historian, I suppose, if I may call you that. Well, you've done a degree and all of that sort of nonsense, haven't you?
I've done a lot of that nonsense, yeah.
You've done a lot of studying, as opposed to me just spouting my mouth and hoping that some of it's true. And it's always good to get clarification from somebody who knows. So thank you for coming back. So where shall we start with this notion of history and where we are?
Well, should I just start by saying why on earth should I be talking about this?
Yeah, why on earth, Chris?
Why on earth
should you be talking?
Because there's lots of people. YouTube is full of people talking about all sorts of things. So I've got a degree in history and I've got a master's degree in history, but so have thousands of people.
Yes.
So in itself, that doesn't really mean an awful lot. And studying history at academic level makes you think in a structured way, and that's the benefit of it. The disbenefit is that it makes you think in a structured way.
Well, I can see that,
and therefore you can be on tram lines and you can miss things because your mind has been trained to think in a certain way. But I think the two other things that I bring to it is that for a long time I was involved in politics. I won't say which political party I was in, but I haven't got really much time for any of the political parties at the moment.
They're pretty much the same, aren't they?
But I spent many years, and I did stand in the general election in 1997, and I think when you're involved in politics in your own lifetime, then you see the past through that prism,
right?
Which I think in some ways is useful. But the third thing is that I've, over the last 30 years, probably interviewed at least 200 people about their life history, what we call oral history, where you just sit down with someone, they tell you about their life.
Yes.
And the great thing about that is you realise that ordinary people's lives don't go along the lines of politicians or historians.
No, and those people who've written the books.
Indeed. And the things that are important to people in their lives are not generally the things that appear in books.
Right.
So only one politician has, in all those interviews, at least, probably could be more like 300 to be honest, I haven't counted, only one politician has ever been mentioned to me when I've talked to people.
And when you say that, I mean, the figure that would immediately come to mind, I suppose, if these are elderly people, would be somebody like Churchill.
And yet he never got a mention.
He never got a mention?
Unless I mentioned, what did you think of Churchill?
Right.
I'm talking about people of their own volition.
So that's interesting, so that people are not, we'll find out who it is in a minute, so that people don't really have that much time or care for politicians. They're more interested in what's affecting them, even though it might be the politicians who are causing things to affect them.
Exactly, yeah. And people will relate to their own family, their own lives, and maybe their wider community.
Yes.
But that's a very different history to what you see in a book.
Absolutely. So we better put us out our misery and find out which politician out of these 200 to 300 people actually was mentioned.
Yeah, so the politician was Aneurin Bevan, and not to be confused with Ernest Bevin, who was both Ernest Bevin and Aneurin Bevan were both in the immediate post-war Labour government.
Right.
But Aneurin Bevan was the man who created the National Health Service. So some of the people I've interviewed, when they've talked about, I said, what was life like after the Second World War? And they said, well, one thing that improved was healthcare, all thanks to Aneurin Bevan.
Right.
So, but even then, it was only a few people, but at least he did get a mention.
And I wonder what they would think now of the healthcare.
Well, yeah, what would Aneurin Bevan think?
Yes.
I mean, he wanted everything to be free at the point of delivery. But of course, in his day, the number of possible cures, therapies, was so fewer.
Yes.
we've got this multiplicity
Absolutely.
of possibilities, and of course some of which may or may not do you more harm than good, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We couldn't possibly say which. So that's interesting. So that people are much more interested in what happens to them, clearly, than any historical what would I call it?
Some big events.
Yes, yeah. Putting their into their place in history is what I was trying to get to.
Unless you ask them, like, you know,
yes.
what did you think of Hitler? What did you think of Churchill? It would be quite unusual for them to offer that themselves.
Right.
You know,
and were these elderly people that you were talking to?
Yeah, I mean, so the people I've interviewed, I think the youngest person I interviewed was probably 70.
Right.
The oldest person I ever interviewed was 104.
Wow.
And she was born in 1896, so it was some years ago that I interviewed her. And she remembered soldiers coming home from the Boer War. So that,
yes.
You know.
So we're sort of drifting off where we were going, but when you're interviewing people of a certain age who are in their 70s plus, is it you're poking their memory when you perhaps ask about certain politicians or the time that they grew up in? Are people of that age more concerned of the immediate time? So if you're talking to them, they're really only going to be talking, you know, they're not talking back, oh yes, when I was a kid, this and this.
Yeah, I mean, generally you find with older people that their memories from when they were a child or a young adult are sharp.
Right.
And then they get more and more hazy.
So they don't know what they did yesterday, but
No,
they can remember when they were 5.
But there are a few people, and they're quite rare, who keep a sharp memory throughout their entire life. So they can dip in to any point, maybe in their 90 years, and give you a lot of information.
Right.
But generally I've found that once people get married, they get a mortgage, they get a job, they can tell you all about that, but everything else becomes a bit hazy.
So these people, and where we're going with this, I mean, these are all English people.
Yeah.
So do they have a feeling about being England? Because England, over the last 100 years, has changed a lot. We've opened the doors to all sorts of different nationalities. A lot of people consider themselves maybe British or even European and not necessarily English, and yet they may well be English, and they may, you know, people's ideas of who they are and how they identify themselves have changed, do you think?
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing with that is that it's only when identities are perceived to be under threat that people start saying, I'm English, I'm British, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So years ago, when people were very comfortable and relaxed in their identity, they didn't talk about it really because it was a given.
Yes.
But it's when people start to feel that maybe their identity's slipping away or maybe things are out of their control that they sort of assert themselves perhaps more aggressively.
Right.
So people growing up in the early years of the last century, you know, their sense of who they were was quite strong. What people often did talk about was their local identity being eroded.
Right.
Because of the huge urbanisation, how small towns became big towns and huge numbers of people coming in. And they'd often say, oh, Chris, it's, you know, when I was a child, you knew everyone. I knew everyone in this street, and now I don't know anyone. So that was the sort of thing.
So that's interesting you say it, because I've read a number of books written in the 30s, and it talks about this urbanisation, where it all starts to go. And the authors of these books are talking about this as it's happening then. And it so resonates with me because they're talking about the architecture, the number of people coming in, the increasing gobbling up of the countryside, and you think, to be back then in the 1930s with the extra countryside that you would have had that is now disappeared would be nice. But even then, they were aware that this was coming, and so in a way, we're always thinking, hang on, the landscape is being encroached on, or there are more people, or it was simpler when we were younger or in the past.
Yeah, and small little towns and villages, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the population didn't really change much at all. And if it did change, it was something like the Black Death cutting it down.
Right.
It's only really since the Industrial Revolution and really since the 19th century when it's taken off in a huge way. and with population has increased massively. And you said about the 1930s, there was a book in the 1930s, I can't remember who it was written by, I think it was called England and the Octopus.
Oh, right.
The idea.
Yes, I've heard
Did you come
of
across that one?
Yeah, I've heard. I'm not quite sure.
This sort of urbanisation, tentacles all over the country,
Yes.
changing everything.
Yeah.
And people losing control.
And I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel that's very much the case now, especially in the environment that we're in, that I often talk about with some of these diktats which are coming down, that you do feel that you're out of control. And you can imagine back in those very urban times where you were close-knit and food production was very much the centre of things, and you had the lord of the manor, or the few farms that were giving you much of the work, and you were a close-knit family in a village, that everything was fine. And then as urbanisation and more population expands and people are travelling around a bit, you do feel a bit threatened. I mean, I remember reading in these books when they're talking about people from the next village coming over, and they're going, "We don't want none of them foreigners here." And you know, and now of course we're talking about people from thousands of miles away, and embracing all of that. You also wanted to mention statute law, just doing a sea change here because we didn't have a huge amount of time, and its relationship to common law, because I know that some of my people have talked about these areas. And
well, yeah, that's so. If we go, viewers, we're going right back now, 1,500 years or so, and it does follow on from what we've just been talking about, because it took a long time for English identity to evolve. There wasn't suddenly one day there was England.
No.
So you have to go back to the end of the Roman Empire, when Britain was part of the empire. It was part of that huge trading bloc. The Roman military withdrew, and therefore the trade stopped. And without trade, all the prosperity, particularly in southern Britain, just vanished, and there were desolated towns. The wealthy people fled to better parts of the empire, and then people came in. Jutes, Saxons, Angles. But they didn't necessarily get on, did they?
No.
And for several hundreds of years, there were lots of conflicts between the different English kingdoms. So there was Sussex, there was Wessex, East Anglia, all in conflict. And each area had their own laws. But those laws were generally in the head. They were in the oral tradition. And then later you had the Vikings coming in. So then you had more conflict.
Yes.
So all the people who make up the English, it wasn't a painless birth. There was lots of conflict over hundreds of years. And I think the key point, and so some of your guests, and I've seen this online, people talking about the common law versus statute law, and then Magna Carta, come on to that. The key moment, I would say, in early English history was when we get King Edgar in the 10th century, and he was one of the first kings who say, "I'm king of all England." But Archbishop Dunstan thought, the trouble is we get a king and everyone's happy, then the king dies, and then there's this furor about who should be the next king.
Right.
So we've got to try and settle the succession by saying that Edgar isn't just king by chance. He isn't king because he had more swords than anyone else. He's king by divine right. God has willed it. So
you're saying they just made that up?
They didn't. No.
So they got, do you know what? Here's a ruse. He's just going to be by yeah, that's good. That'll do it.
I don't think. No, I think your Christianity, of course, was something that gradually united all the people of this country. So they didn't make it up. What I think the Archbishop was doing is, how can we formalise this in a way that makes it accepted? So that at Edgar's coronation, he wasn't just crowned, he was anointed. And ever since then, 1100 years ago or more, every king of England has been anointed. So that this isn't just by accident. It gives that divine and religious aspect to it. And that helped solidify England and make England a strong country. until, of course, we then get 1066 and William the Conqueror.
Right. So I thought England was created by Athelstan.
Athelstan is generally regarded as the first king to be king of all the English.
Right.
But that was by force of arms.
Yes.
He defeated the Vikings.
Right. Okay.
So he was king of all England, and that was probably 80, 90 years before Edgar. But that didn't stop the conflict.
I see.
So and Edgar's reign was the first reign where there were no wars, and he was called, Alfred the Great, Ethelred the Unready, Edgar the Peaceable.
Edgar the Peaceable. It sounds nice.
And so, even taking a view, they made it up. Whatever it was, if it created peace, it was a very valuable innovation. And in that period, some of the great Saxon churches were built, and the beautiful manuscripts were written down. So it was a flourishing of English culture. In a form that still survives today in manuscripts and so forth.
Quite a rarity to have a king, though, who didn't start a conflict.
Yeah, well, that was an era. It was an era of conflict. I mean, there were the reign of Edward the Confessor is often referred to as a very peaceful reign. But then his favourite was Harold Godwin, who, when Edward the Confessor dies, said, right, I'm king. But here's the point. He was king because he was the most powerful man in England.
Yes.
But he wasn't king because he was next in line to the throne. Hence William of Normandy saying, yeah, but I've got more claim than you. And we all know what happened at Hastings in 1066.
Yeah, I could have been there. I had an arrow in the... Well, assuming that's true, of course. But, yes, he got defeated.
And so, coming back to common law, statute law. So basically the English laws, even then, they were still different in different parts of the country. The Normans, they were ruling by force. Yes. And they built castles everywhere. And they built cathedrals and monasteries that are religious, but they're also symbols of Norman power. And the thing to get about this is that all the Saxon aristocracy were either killed or they lost their land. So all the land of England was in the hands of the Normans. Yes. And the weird thing is, a lot of the land of England is still in the hand of their descendants.
Which, I mean, I know that the sovereign lot out there who watch this and all of that, who go by natural law or God's law, however you want to talk it, would say this is the crux of it, that you've got land taken by force. So you come down the line to our current situation, these people shouldn't own the land anyway, because it's, they've taken it.
Yeah, they have, but then of course the Saxons took it before them, and
the
Romans
took it
before them. But I think even now, all these years later, after 1066, we are still shaped and affected by that moment, and the class system of England is still there. If I said to you, oh Richard, I'm going to introduce you to two people. One lives in a council flat in Littlehampton, the other's got a great big pile up country, and one's called Bill Smith and one's called Philip Legrand. Who would you instantly think lived in which house?
Well, you'd be making a huge, a simple assumption that Bill Smith was down there in the council house, and Philip Legrand would be up there in the dirty great pile.
Yeah, because of the Frenchness, and the old police series, Z cars and all that, when they were after villains, which is from the Norman French word for villain, a peasant.
Yes.
And when people try and impress in a conversation, je ne sais quoi, why is that impressive to say French?
Yes.
Because they were the learned people. So that is definitely, and most of the people who've been governing us in recent years, especially someone like David Cameron or Boris Johnson, they're antecedents, Cameron more than Johnson actually, are in these old families. And the Duke of Norfolk in Arundel Castle, well, he's directly descended from the people who seized the land in 1066. But the common law bit, right? So you had common law all over England, and it was all different. And William the Conqueror he was just wanted to control his land. He had the Doomsday Book where he wanted to know who had what.
Yes.
It was a few reigns later, we get Henry II. This is the key. Henry II, he was king of England and Normandy and most of France. It was an empire. And he needed to know what the law was everywhere. So he went around England writing it all down. This is the law. This is the statute law. And a lawyer travelled with him, writing it all down. This is now the law because we've written it. Yeah. And they rolled it up in pipes. And that's where the expression, the master of the rolls, comes from. Right.
Yeah. There was me thinking it was like ham or cheese. Obviously got that completely wrong. Give me another roll. I can't eat this.
So it was. So a lot of it was just common law translated into statute law.
So is that they were, as I understand, a lot of the common law is that it's as you've gone around and you've made the law, because you may have come across things that had never happened before, and so you've got Edward Legrand against Bill Smith, and this killing of a hen on his property, and he says, right, okay, you shouldn't do that. So that then that becomes the law because it's been tried. Is that correct?
Yeah, once it's written down.
And so once they wrote that, and they're travelling around gauging how it. They must have been gauging how it differed,
and then trying to standardise.
Standardising, yeah.
And also, of course, in the common law, you've got trial by combat.
Oh right, we don't do so much of that these days. I'm sure a lot of people would love to do a bit of that.
So if someone wronged you,
yes,
well, I'll fight you and decide then. Or
and does that come from the French? Is that the thing where they throw down the gauntlet and they say, you have insulted me, you evil little man.
Well, no, this was older than the Normans, but
right.
Yeah, it's and the carrying the hot iron,
Oh right, yes.
And if it hadn't blistered after so long, you were telling the truth and all this sort of stuff.
Yes.
But at this point, there was no Parliament. So the first Parliament is 1265, Simon de Montfort. And that's when Parliament starts making laws. So you've got the common law of England, you've got Henry II bringing in the first written laws, and then from 1265 you've got Parliament creating laws. And then in between you've got the Magna Carta.
Right, and this is where King John has his feet to the fire.
Yeah.
By the barons.
By the barons. And that's the point, that the Magna Carta is about protecting the interests of the barons, not the ordinary people. Nearly all the clauses of the Magna Carta are about what's good for the barons.
Right.
There is habeas corpus, that no free man can be imprisoned without due cause and of the law. But then most people weren't free men. Most people were serfs or villeins.
Right.
So the Magna Carta, the idea is this is a great document of liberty. It isn't really. And of course the peasantry rebelled. Now, the idea that Magna Carta gives you the right to rebel, well, if it did, it didn't. It wasn't working, was it?
Well, I think even now, if you rebel, it's like, what are your chances? Because the government of the day is likely to want to quash it anyway, using their employed brutes, which might be the police or the army or some professional duffer-uppers.
And it ever was thus. You got the Peasants' Revolt, 1381, Jack Cade's Rebellion, 1450, Kett's Rebellion, 1549, and loads of little ones in between. So the peasantry would often rise up. Now, when they rose up, their cry was always throw off the Norman yoke.
Right.
So that they didn't, they weren't talking about Magna Carta or even, I don't think, common law. It was throwing off the Norman yoke. That they saw the aristocracy as a foreign occupier, even hundreds of years later.
Yes. Right.
And the Peasants' Revolt, Wat Tyler, John Bull,
Jack Straw.
Yeah, Jack Straw, not the one from a few decades ago.
Decades ago in the past. Otherwise, he's aged very well.
Yeah, not General Pinochet's friend. No, not that Jack Straw. But their flag was the flag of St. George.
Right.
So they got a white sheet and they put a blood cross on it. And now St. George seems to have been adopted by ordinary soldiers who fought the Crusades. Their lord took them on the Crusades. They're out in the Middle East. can you imagine a medieval peasant being taken to the Middle East?
Yeah, no, I can't. I mean, can't conceive it really, because the whole journey there in these old ships and all of that you would have to go there. I mean, you'd be so out of your comfort zone.
And just it would have been, so that what did they latch onto? And they latched onto a Maronite saint, St. George, who killed the dragon, and they thought, oh yeah, we can identify with that.
Yes.
And they brought it back to England. But it was really the common people who brought that saint to England, rather than it being imposed from above. It was
right. So not like the Pope saying this person
no,
is
not
a
like
saint.
the Pope, or indeed the King.
Or indeed, yeah.
I mean, St. George already was a saint, but how he became the patron saint of England was really from his popularity with the common people, and the siege of Calais. When the English were besieging Calais and the French were getting nearer and nearer, and the English soldiers were all supposed to have prayed to St. George, and the next day Calais surrendered. So that increased the popularity of St. George.
It works.
And then the peasants' revolt, you see, where they used the cross of St. George. This is the revolutionary flag, really, the cross of St. George. And even though the rebellion is crushed...
But it still feels, I mean, just on that note, it still feels now when you fly the English flag, it is a rebel thing, because you've got it on football matches, in a way, it's quite rebellious. And then in ordinary peacetime, you don't really see it. People aren't proud of it. But if they want to make a statement, an English statement, they will still use that flag almost. I don't know. I mean, I'm just ventilating. I'm speculating that it's like when I was making videos and you're trying to say, hey, I'm English, and it's kind of like a big statement. I was using the flag to do that, almost as if I'm just not lying down to be British or just part of the sort of mix, the homogenous mix of whoever happens to live on this island.
And Englishness got subsumed into Britishness. So the Act of Union with Scotland, that the Scottish nationalists always say was us being put down, at the time, a lot of people in England saw, we've been taken over by the Scots.
Right.
And George III's Prime Minister, Lord Bute, was Scottish. And so protesters in London marched around with a boot on a stick, kick out Bute.
Yeah, boot him out.
And then the Empire came. And then in the Victorian era, the British Empire, so Englishness got lost in Britishness, then Britishness got lost in imperialism, and then the Empire ended, and ever since then...
We don't know where we are.
Who are we? Who are we? I think the thing about Englishness, I feel, is that it needs to be a positive thing.
Yes.
Rather than people saying, I'm English because I hate them and I don't like that. The positiveness of, of our landscape, of our literature, of Shakespeare, of our folk traditions, our folk song. I think that's the positive way to re-establish Englishness.
Well, my channel, for those who don't know and have only come in recent times when I've been talking about the various things that I've been talking about, was all about Englishness. It was all about wandering around.
Well, you did all those tours, didn't you?
Yeah, and you're pointing at these old buildings and talking about who own them and the eccentricity of it and all of that. And in a way, I sort of with a cravat and waistcoats and stuff embody what it means to me. And everybody will have every Englishman will have their own version of what Englishness is to them. We're not just bowler hat, stripy suit, umbrellas, all that sort of thing that was around in the 50s and 60s. So, yes, I think that you're right. There should be, anybody identifying any of their nationality should be a positive.
But of course, there is always a danger that nationalism comes in, or racial nationalism, which is the worst form of nationalism.
Yes.
Because that always leads to conflict and it never ends well. But when people feel their identity is under pressure, of course, that is a dangerous moment.
So when you say these people are rising up and they're using the English flag, or they're identifying, but they're saying throw off the Norman yoke. Do you think that's still the situation today? We feel that we are that these landowners, as you said, some of them have still a direct descendancy to the Norman period.
Yeah, kick the Duke out of his castle.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it's shifted slightly, hasn't it? It's shifted. I mean, you've still got the great landowners.
Yes.
But the mass of power and wealth, unless they've, changed their interests, and some of them have, like the Duke of Westminster with all his investments, it's much more international corporatism now that we face as a challenge. I mean, these rebellions I talked about, although they were put down, they still advanced the cause of the people of England. So improvements were made.
Yes.
I think one interesting parallel we could draw historically with our own times is good old Henry VIII, and he tends to be the king that if even people who aren't interested in history, they know of Henry VIII.
Yes.
And what did Henry VIII do? He had 6 wives and he killed 2 of them. But of course, the other thing Henry VIII did was, he seized the church lands.
Right.
Yeah.
And he separated from Catholicism. Cozy. From Catholicism to Protestantism, and we saw the separation from the Vatican,
from the Pope. Yeah.
From the Pope, although the conspiracy element would say that is still going on underneath, that Rome is still in control.
Well, I don't know if Rome is in control of the Church of England. I'm not sure if the Church of England is in control of the Church of England.
Well,
I think the Archbishop is a bit woolly. But the thing that Henry VIII did, basically, he was a second-rate king, spending as if he was the King of Spain.
Right.
And he didn't want to stop spending. So he seized the church land. So it was a nationalisation followed immediately by a privatisation. So seizing the land in itself wasn't much use to him, but he had all these wealthy merchants in England. And they were people from those peasant rebellions that I mentioned. The people who actually gained, serfdom disappeared. And a lot of people who had been poor peasants over the generations amassed more land and more wealth and more interests. And they became wealthy London merchants. So they had money, but they hadn't got status. Right. They were still poor people, really, even though they had lots of money. So the king basically seized the church land. Here's the nouveau riche. We'll sell you this land, then we'll give you a title.
Right.
So, and he sold it dirt cheap. Again, reminiscent of the 1980s, privatizations,
Yeah.
And these people then, of course, became unbelievably rich. And that is the origin of where we are today with international corporate capitalism. How did it start off that people became excessively rich? It comes from the Reformation and what Henry VIII did. And it was so traumatic, Richard, so traumatic. Recently up at Walsingham, where there was the shrine to St Mary, where peasants believed they'd seen the Virgin Mary. And for hundreds of years, the people of England would go there and going on a pilgrimage. It wasn't all somberness. There'd be lots of drinking and singing. And,
They'd love a little bit of the old.
But when they got there, it meant a lot to them. And, of course, a lot of the Catholic shrines incorporated earlier pagan practices. I say pagan, inverted commas, older practices. What did Henry VIII do? He took all the shrines in England to London and burnt them. And those who objected, including 2 priors at not Glastonbury, what did I just say? Walsingham, yeah, at Walsingham, were hung, drawn and quartered for opposing, And so it was a brutal time. And then, of course, that eventually led to the English Civil War. That whole... Because basically the wealthy men of England, having got wealth and power, they've got their land, they've got their status. Now we want to be running things. We don't want the king running things. We want to run things.
Right. So it's greed all the way through.
It's greed, a friend of mine really had made me think about things because, as I say, I was involved in politics, and I've turned to things. Is that left wing? Is that right wing? Is that centre? And he said to me that basically it's all about psychopathic personalities seizing power. And so actually, when you think about it, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Mao, it's their personality trait.
Yes.
That the psychopathic person who wants total power for its own sake.
Yes, with no regard
to, they have no sense of anyone else.
No.
And when you just look at the horrors of what Stalin did or Mao did in China, it's unbelievable. Millions,
yes,
died because this, and that's the problem with revolutions, that you get injustice and you get a revolution by the people, but then there's a vacuum because you've got rid of the old state.
Yeah,
but you haven't created anything new, and the psychopaths rush in because they see an opportunity. And I think, to come back to England and Englishness, and not losing our way here.
No, it's a fascinating conversation.
I think the great thing about England is reform. That England has managed to, apart from the Civil War and Cromwell, we've managed to reform things.
Right.
And throughout the 19th century, there was reform. Yes, the rich were still rich, the powerful were still powerful, but gradually, I would say, from the early 19th century up until the 1980s, the poorer people were getting a better deal.
Right.
The poorer people were getting better off vis-a-vis the rich. Their educational opportunities were better, health was better, everyone was living longer. But now, of course, we see with excess deaths, this idea that we're all going to keep living longer and more healthy, it's not happening.
No.
And now with the recent inflation, everyone's income's going down, except, of course, look at the profits of BT, look at the profits of the water companies.
So the corporations are making the money.
They're making the money and they've got the power.
Yes.
And our politicians are enfeebled. So when we get to the next general election, who's going to be saying, oh, hang on, we, the people of England, are poorer than we were. And yet the corporations have got billions. BP, BT, gas, electric, and the water companies, they're literally shit, aren't they?
They are.
They're pumping it into the... And here's a point, Richard. The water companies in our part of the world were run by our local council. So my parents and grandparents, through their rates, paid for all the reservoirs around here, and now they're owned by a private company, and now they're saying, oh yes, well we have, it's terrible, there's all this pollution, we've got to put your bills up.
But they've already paid for it to a degree. I mean, well, they're making the pollution, aren't they?
They're making and they're charging us.
And they're charging us, yes.
It's a bit like someone taking over your house and saying, Richard, we don't think you can look after your house. We're taking it over and we're going to charge you a rent.
Yes.
And then after 20 or 30 years, you say to them, yeah, but my roof's leaking, electric isn't working. Oh, okay, well, we'll upgrade it, but we're going to double the rent.
Yes.
Hang on, this used to be my house.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so...
And you can see that's likely to be coming down the pipe, in which in order to get to net zero, we'll all have to improve our house to a standard that's going to be so costly that we can't afford it.
But they can afford it. That's the point. The corporations, they've got so much money, and this is the real conspiracy. It's the conspiracy to take what was ours, to put it into the hands of private corporations, who are then making vast amounts of money. And Southern Water's paying its dividends. Anyone at home, look at what these people earn.
But it's interesting because, as you say there, that the corporations are making the money, but the corporations are only really the vehicles for the people who work for the corporations, because they're the ones who can actually spend the money or do things with the money. A corporation is a sort of a dead entity, isn't it? It's just it's a building or a words on a bit of paper. It's the people who manipulate that corporation, who have access to the bank, who can then say, well, actually, me and my shareholders or me and my board are going to pay ourselves all this money.
Well, yes, so which is the human side of the corporation, if you like, the people who are... But our politicians could say, right, we're taking this back.
Yes. But
and therefore all that money is now going to be for our health service. It's going to be for the things that the people of the country need, because you failed.
Yes.
If you'd succeeded If we had, not one in all the time that Southern Water's been privatised, in our town they haven't built one new reservoir.
No.
And
No, so it's very odd. I mean, it is very odd. But those politicians that you talk of are probably shareholders or on the board of a lot of these corporations.
Or even if they're not, Richard, they are enfeebled. They daren't take action.
I like that word, enfeebled. I'm going to start using that a lot more myself. They are enfeebled.
They won't dare take, because if they said, right, we're going to... And if they took it back into public ownership, it couldn't be like it was before, the old nationalised thing. I would suggest it should be decentralised locally, because the more local something is, the easier it is to have oversight and control over it, and less easy for it to be corrupt.
Absolutely.
So it should be a completely different thing to what it was before. But they wouldn't dare, because the power in the world, which we've seen, in recent years, how these corporations get us to do things and support things that on reflection we think probably wasn't a good idea.
Yes.
It's because those corporations and the politicians and the media are all working together in an unholy alliance.
Yes. But the thing is, the government itself is a corporation. The media is a corporation.
Yeah, there's literal legal corporations, and the government, does it govern? And as for local councils, our local council here, 70 years ago, it ran everything. It ran the schools, it ran the gas, it ran the electric, it almost ran the health service. And now the local council, they can decide, I think we'll have different coloured waste bins.
Yes.
So,
but they can also decide, if you're, without asking anybody, it seems to me, whether we have cameras and biometrics. And 15-minute cities and all of the other stuff.
Well, because and the surveillance thing is interesting, isn't it? When I was involved in politics and when I was on our local county council, I was very opposed to CCTV coming in, because I thought it was the thin end of the wedge.
Yes.
And once people, again, that makes people submissive, doesn't it? We're in danger, therefore we've got to have the cameras, and therefore then we've got to have, what's it going to be, the chip in the arm?
Yes.
Because, something might happen to you, but if you've got the chip, we'll always be able to find you. And after all, if you've got nothing to hide, if you do nothing wrong, why would you worry?
Why would you worry? Exactly.
And I think we've seen... So Henry VIII's time, that climate of fear, we've got a climate of fear now. So first of all, take the last 4 or 5 years. First of all, we had the fear of terrorism, didn't we?
Yes.
We were all terrorised out of our wits that there was this terrorist onslaught. And yet when you look back on it, there were only
a handful of events.
And yet they brought in all this law
yes,
to give the police more power and more surveillance. Going back to draw it all together... Henry VIII, 100 years later, you get the English Civil War, and that had to be resolved by war. We're in a situation where I think the people in this country are being exploited, misused, put down. Now, what we need is a peaceful way to resolve that.
Yes.
But none of our political parties seem to be offering a solution. And
No.
That's the dangerous moment, I think, we're in, from an historian's point of view. What do people do if they can't vote for real change?
Well, will they go down the French Revolution and bring out Madame Guillotine and just slice a few heads off, in which the French seem to do, and which put terror everywhere?
Which put terror everywhere. And of course, then that ended up with Napoleon.
Napoleon.
Yeah.
So that's, clearly a peaceful reckoning has to come about. And I know... there are lots of grass movements who are disagreeing. They talk to me, and there's this sense of a peasant's revolt, as it were. But instead of being violent, there's got to be a way to turn your back on the government and say, do you know what? You're just not doing the right thing. And so we'll make an alternative.
Or get them to change.
And how do you get them to change? Because it seems... as a number of my audience, and I don't know what you feel about this, that there are these think tanks who seem to have hold over the government and over all of the government, apart from very small parties like the Heritage Party, run by David Curtin, who's in Bognor. But they're not going to get in power because they're just not big enough. And so you're going to end up with the main two parties. And unless you're able to completely have a sea change with them, what are you going to do?
It needs some leadership and coherence. And as you were suggesting, there's all these little disparate groups, and that won't do it.
No.
So when there's been big change in England, it's because vast numbers of people were united under a particular banner. You know,
Yes.
Cromwell won the Civil War, really, because he had this powerful army that was disciplined
Yes.
and was able to defeat the Royalists. In the 19th century, which is my benchmark, you know, from about 1815 up until about 1980, things improved. Now, a lot of people say to me, yeah, but they didn't improve enough. But they were improving.
Right.
Because the people put the pressure on the politicians to make the change. But maybe we've got too affluent, maybe we've got too lazy, and people have just put up with rubbish, really, haven't they?
I mean, one of the things that I argue, and you may have heard me argue this many times, is that we have allowed all our own responsibility to be done by the government. I mean, the government's willingly said, don't worry about that, we'll do it. They've done it shoddily, and then we've become so lazy, I think, and we've gone in for convenience to the point that we can no longer survive on our own, because, you know, as soon as something happens, you think, oh, well, why isn't the council doing that, or why isn't the government doing that? It's not people going together, do you know, this is our street, why don't we go and pick up the litter? Why don't we fill in the potholes? If the council aren't going to do it, why don't we all just club together and do it? I mean, I know the council would then be saying, oh, you can't do that. You can't go putting your own cement into the... Well, you say, but you're not bloody well doing it.
No. It's...
But it kind of feels that people have got to...
Yeah,
they've got to challenge these people, or at least sort of hold a mirror up and say, you're not doing what we want. But people have just, eyes down, dealing with whatever rubbish is thrown at them.
But there is a sea change taking place. But I think people have lost their traditions. So I think in the past, you know, these peasant rebellions I talked about, or even more recent times when the people took to the streets, they'd learnt that from their parents.
Yes.
But that has all been watered down, particularly since the Second World War. And we've got the consumer society, you know, Simon Cowell and all that sort of stuff, and most people's idea of voting is voting for that, isn't it?
Yes,
you know,
yes.
Who's this year? Who's a celebrity? Get me out of here. And maybe, this is a horrible thing to say, but maybe people have to suffer a bit in terms of losing some of their wealth, or seeing a dear, you know, God forbid, but seeing a dear friend or relative not get the health treatment they need.
Which is what they are doing.
Yeah, to actually then think, why is this happening when there's all this wealth?
Yes.
And why is it all over there, and why hasn't it been spent here where it's needed? But I think people need to, I mean, what you're doing and all these YouTube channels, it's a bit like that period just before the English Civil War when the portable printing press came in.
Right. And
so,
we're all putting out our little bills.
And they were all putting out, everyone started putting out
pamphlets.
And that was one of the things that fueled the uprising against Charles I, because suddenly people were getting information that they'd never had before.
Yes.
But equally, then as now, some of the pamphlets were full of great stuff, and some of it was full of barking stuff.
Well, and probably mine is full of barking stuff. I hope not.
But
it may well be. You know, I'm not saying that everything I say, and mostly my monologues that I do, is my opinion, in which I suppose I'm saying, why is it like this? Why aren't we doing something? And I throw out a few ideas to elicit debate, because I haven't a clue. You know, ultimately, I haven't a clue. I'm quite ignorant, really.
You've probably learnt a lot just from what you've been doing.
Absolutely.
And all the people you've met and spoken to.
I mean, the last 40 minutes, I've learned history, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean, I think positive. People could just keep writing to their MP
Yes.
constantly bombarding them. And I know it's laborious and sometimes they don't reply. Or the few MPs, and there are a handful of them who are doing a good job, write to them. You're doing a good job. Thank you for standing up on that issue. So, you know, buoy up the few that are good, put pressure on the ones that aren't doing what we want. And in the end...
I know that my listeners have done that. They've written on that particular medical intervention that we mentioned, but the thing is that, and they've shared the responses, and there is clearly a message that has been handed down because all the different MPs that people have shared with me through the emails is, oh no, it's almost the same script coming back, safe and effective. We believe in it, safe and effective. We believe it. Never mind the government's own yellow card system. Never mind Andrew Bridgen standing up and questioning it, and everybody going, "Oh, run for the hills. We mustn't listen to it," because there is on that issue, and I think it would be the same on net zero and on some of these things that the government have decided without being in the manifesto that this is going to happen. Digital IDs, central bank digital currency, and all of this that we know is coming because they keep telling us.
I mean, the net zero could be a positive thing if it means reducing pollution, but not if it's increasing pollution, if it's all a sleight of hand. See, the government, there's a lot of sleight of hand going on. They, you know, look at that, don't look at this.
Yes.
You know, the magician's trick.
Yes.
So it's this thing like, you know, the small boats coming over. And everyone, you know, we've got to stop the small boats. We've got to stop the small boats. Well, I think there's what, 40,000 people came over on the small boats. But I believe I'm correct in saying
far more.
670,000 came in legally last year. It's certainly over 600,000. So these and why are these people coming here from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya?
Yeah.
Didn't someone wreck their countries by bombing the hell out of them? You know.
Well, they've obviously got the wrong brochure. I mean, I feel partly responsible because I made videos showing how lovely England is, and I can't help feeling that there are people on the other side of the world going, "Look at Phobes' video. That looks a nice place. It's green. There's trees. There's old houses. We'll go over there." They must get a shock when they come over and are put into these barracks, apart from those in the first-class hotels, which are not all the first-class hotels, but then they don't sort of have any appreciation of that because it's not their culture, it's not their tradition.
And they wouldn't, you know, what we did to Libya, that was the most prosperous country in Africa. And why was it bombed for 5 months? Again, people at home, can you remember, why did we bomb Libya for 5 months? And now it's a smoking ruin. And of course, all these people are flooding out. Well, they wouldn't have been flooding out if it was a functioning country.
No.
But no one, like the Fergal Walsh thing, no one brings Cameron up and said, "Oh, you waged this war in Libya. It cost a huge amount of money. What exactly was the benefit? Not just for the Libyans, what was the benefit for us? It was the opposite."
Yes.
But they're not brought to account. Do you know, only 13 MPs voted against the bombing of Libya. And I think half of them are out of Parliament now.
Yeah. Well, this is the system that we've got. It's pretty much corrupt. Or we're being misinformed by mainstream media. They all seem to be ganging up and having the same message. And for some reason, we're in that position where a lot of people are distracted by their Instagram and the fluffy cats on YouTube and don't want to engage in serious questions. You know, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but schools don't train children to think critically. They train them more to be obedient, tax-paying servants.
Well, I mean, let's be fair to teachers. They've got a horrible job.
Well, they have.
They're under a huge amount of pressure from government diktats.
Yes.
Because one time teachers had a lot of flexibility. Now they're hamstrung.
Yes.
But some about positive things. I mean, I go into schools a lot, and I talk about English heritage and the South Downs and promoting English folk song. And I went into one school's, you know, let's try and be positive, what can be done. And the teacher said, you know, "Chris, some of these lads, they do cause a lot of trouble in the school, you know, just be aware of that." And I came in and I started singing some of these songs, and I thought, you know, this old chap singing these songs, But they loved it. And the kids, I taught them the verses, and they sang the verses back of these old songs. And at the end of it, the teacher said, the lad who was particularly troublesome, he said he was transfixed by you all the way through. That's not because I'm marvellous. It's just...
Oh, you are, Chris. You're marvellous. Isn't he marvellous?
What is marvellous is that culture and something that they never heard before, and that boy, you know, really got something from it.
Yes.
So maybe the thing to do is for all of us to learn about our culture and to celebrate it and to find strength through it, and therefore hopefully, see, the political parties filter out the people. So whereas years ago you got maverick politicians in all the parties,
Yes,
you know, who would be a pain in the arse for the leaders.
Yes, they don't want that.
Now they're just these machine people.
Yes.
You know, some of them, you watch them on the television, you think, is there a human being in there? What?
Oh, I know. And Matt Hancock keeps telling us he's a human being, apparently. He's programmed to say, I am a human being, I am a human being. Take the vaccine, I am a human being. We're going to have to draw it to a close, Chris.
We are.
Don't forget, Chris has a book. I'll put the link in the description. It's Hare Belloc, The Politics.
Yeah, and we haven't really spoken about him. And really...
I'll link back to the other interview.
He had a lot to say, I think, about the times in which we're living. He was quite prophetic, and I think people can learn a lot through reading what he said.
Especially in your book.
I hope that's true.
It's been fascinating to leap back in time and get a grounding on history and where we are, and put into perspective the common law and the statute law, and how King Henry was pivotal to a lot of things. There's a lot we can blame back on him. But anyway, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Richard.
And I hope you'll come back and we could do some more.
Indeed.
I'm sure people would be very interested. Put your questions to Chris, and it'll be interesting to see the comments. But for now, just for time only, I've got another interview to record, so I have to kick him out and get the next one in. I'm sorry to say. But it's been absolutely brilliant. I've loved it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
So join me again for another interview and another monologue on the channel. But from Chris and I, thanks very much. He says, looking for the button to turn it off. Till next time, goodbye.